Hey, this is Chris. I want to talk a little bit more today about is communion. But we are still deep in the Old Testament talking about the roots of communion, the basis of it, what has come before that points the way towards communion. We all know that the Old Testament, the law and the prophets point directly towards Jesus Christ, and so therefore anything that he did must also have been pointed to in the Old Testament. And so we've been talking about Passover as the root of communion. And so last time we talked in Exodus, where God initially gave the commands for Passover, how it was to be done, when it was to be done, what kind of animal was supposed to be obtained. And so the next relevant passage here is in Leviticus, where there are rules and regulations for the various feasts and assemblies of Israel. And when we look in verse 4, so we start in 23:4. These are the Lord's appointed times, holy assemblies, which you must proclaim at their appointed time. Verse 5, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is a Passover offering to the Lord. And so there you go, just basically a restating of what God had already said in Exodus. Noting again carefully that there is no mention of any interaction with a priest. I still think that is so incredibly important, and it really does, if there's really a prophetic function of Passover, the fact that there is no priest involved, that these Israelite men, either with their own family or in conjunction with another family, if there weren't enough people in a single family to eat an entire lamb, they were to do this thing. So they took the lamb and they got it on the 10th, and they took care of it for the three or 4 days, however you want to count them. And then they're the ones who sacrificed the lamb, and they're the ones who cooked the lamb, and they're the ones who prepared the meal, and then they ate it, and there wasn't supposed to be any left. And so all God's saying here is like, yep, there you go. That's what you're supposed to do on the 14th of the month. And then the next relevant verse is down here, 37. Verse 37, again, we're in Leviticus 23, verse 37. These are the appointed times of the Lord that you must proclaim as holy assemblies to present a gift to the Lord, burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifice, and drink offerings each day according to its regulations, beside the Sabbaths of the Lord and all your gifts, votive offerings and freewill offerings, which you must give to the Lord. And so all he's really saying is there's a regulation for each of these assemblies. The regulation for the Passover was given in Exodus 12, and that still stands. And so as a student of the Bible who believes in the coherency and the consistency of Scripture, and I think that is really one of my big things, is that if there's if we're on a topic like this, we're on Passover, I expect that all of the Old Testament verses that refer to Passover, and that any New Testament verses that might refer to Passover, they're all consistent. They're self-consistent. They're coherent. They all say the same thing. And so, this is kind of the reason why I'm going through this so carefully. So all God's saying here in verse 37 is if there's a rule for a day, that's the way you're supposed to keep it, and that's what I've said. And so, the ordinances and regulations for the Sabbath, God didn't change a thing. He just said, just make sure you do them the way I told you to do them. And so that's good. Our next passage will be in Deuteronomy, where there will be a slight tweaking of the regulations, but I think, and it's only in one area of the regulation, there's nothing changed about the sacrifice or the meal in particular. It has to do with location. But once we get into that, we're going to find out that it is entirely consistent. And the way Jesus celebrated Passover, consistent with what these Old Testament regulations said. And we will also see how the Passover meal perfectly segues into communion, into what Jesus did on the night he was betrayed. I mean, it was everything he did encapsulated what had come before, and yet it brought forth something new. And yet the same basic underlying principles of the two things, that is of Passover and communion, they are the same. The purpose is the same. It's just a different way of doing things, a different regulation, a different way of, well, it is a different way of approaching God. I guess that would be the difference. A much more personal way. But the way Passover prefigures communion is I really think it's a beautiful thing. And so we'll get into that next time. And so until then, God bless you.